The laughter started before Marisol even made it to the table. At first it was just a murmur, whispers rippling through the women clustered near the dessert spread, their lace shawls pulled tight against the mountain air, drifting through the open windows of the Santo Cielo Community Hall. Then came the sharp cluck of Señora Vidal's tongue, loud enough to turn heads, followed by a comment that sliced through the holiday music like a blade. Dios mío, did a child make these? Marisol Ortega froze her wooden tray, trembling in her gloved hands. The cookies, shaped carefully like elephants glazed with cinnamon sugar, and still warm from her tiny oven, suddenly looked ridiculous beneath the strings of papel picado fluttering above. She took a slow breath, staring down at the tray. They weren't fancy like the others on the long table. No delicate icing flowers, no silver sugar beads, no towering pastelillos. Just her father's old bizcochito recipe, shaped with the same elephant mold he'd carved from mesquite wood before the fever took him 6 years ago. Señorita Ortega. Señora Vidal said, turning toward her, voice syrupy but sharp. Are you lost? The children's table is over there. She gestured lazily to the corner where toddlers tugged at skirts and old men smoked by the fireplace. A ripple of laughter followed, cruel and practiced. Marisol placed the tray down anyway. Her heart pounded against her ribs, and her face burned beneath the gaze of nearly every woman in the room, most of whom had been her father's customers once, before his bakery was sold, before her name became a pity whispered in back rooms and pews. She straightened her back. They're elephant-shaped bizcochitos, she said softly. For the children. Señora Talavera, standing beside Vidal, sniffed and raised a painted brow. Elephants. For Christmas, she leaned in. Maybe for a circus, but not for a church festival. More laughter. This time it hurt deeper. Marisol took a step back, folding her hands to stop them from shaking. Her eyes found the edge of the hall, the exit. Her escape. She could leave now. No one would stop her. Not a soul here wanted her. Ama, look. A small voice pierced through the noise, sweet and high. A little girl in a red ribbon dress had broken away from her mother's skirt and now stood wide-eyed in front of Marisol's tray. They're elephants. Can I have one, Mama, please? The room stilled. Mothers stared, unsure whether to let the child touch the joke on the table. Marisol knelt beside the tray and smiled, her voice steady, despite the pounding in her ears. Would you like to try one, cariño? The girl nodded eagerly. Marisol picked out the smallest cookie and placed it gently in the child's palm. She bit into it. Her entire face changed. It's delicious, she said, turning to shout at a group of children nearby. Come see, they're little elephants. A stampede of kids arrived within seconds, giggling, pointing, and marveling. How did you make the trunk like that? Can I have a baby elephant? They smell like cinnamon. For the first time that evening, Marisol smiled. Not just with her mouth, but with something she hadn't felt in a long time. Something that lived behind her ribs and had been quiet for too many years. The children were reaching, laughing, asking her questions. She told them about her papa and the way he used to say, "A cookie can be a smile if you bake it right." Then she felt the chill crawl back in. Oh, how fitting, Señora Vidal's voice rang out louder this time. Elephant cookies, made by the elephant herself. The silence snapped back like a whip. Mothers stopped mid-reach. Children fell quiet, confused. Marisol froze. Vidal took a step forward, her lips curled. I mean, let's be honest. You really leaned into the theme, didn't you? Laughter erupted again, harsher now, meant to humiliate. Mothers pulled their children away with whispered warnings and stiff smiles. Little hands clutched uneaten cookies as they were guided back toward acceptable desserts. The girl with the red ribbon turned to her mother, whispering, "But I liked them." "Don't eat anymore," her mother snapped. "Spit it out." "No, Mama," the girl protested, but the mother had already whisked her away. Marisol stood alone beside the table, the tray now half empty, not from love but from shame. Her throat burned, but she refused to cry. Not here. Not for them. She reached to gather her cookies. "Let me help you throw those away," Vidal said, reaching for the tray. A hand caught hers. "What are you doing?" The voice was low and firm. The kind of voice that didn't raise in anger, it simply made people listen. Every head turned. Rafael Morales stood a few feet away, his tall frame wrapped in a dark poncho dusted with snow. His hand gripped Vidal's wrist, not roughly, but with enough strength to stop her cold. The flicker of discomfort in her eyes was immediate. "You're about to waste perfectly good food," he said, releasing her wrist and picking up one of the elephant cookies. His rough fingers didn't hesitate. He bit into it, chewed, and closed his eyes. Marisol watched, breath caught in her chest. When he opened them again, he looked straight at her. "This," he said, "tastes like home." Murmurs rippled across the room. Vidal's face twitched, ready to speak, but Rafa kept going. "My grandmother used to make bizcochitos just like this. Cinnamon, anise, buttery like sunshine. You can't fake that. You either know how to bake it or you don't." He lifted the tray in both hands. "I'll be taking these." Vidal opened her mouth. "You don't need to," she began. "I do," he interrupted. Then to Marisol. "Who taught you my father?" she whispered, before he passed. "He taught you well." He turned to the room, scanning the faces. "Shame none of you saw it." And then, without waiting for anyone else to speak, he tipped his hat to her and walked out, the front door tray in hand, leaving silence and cinnamon in his wake. Marisol stood at the table, hands trembling, not from fear, but from the rush of something else. Something warm. Something terrifying. The eyes were still on her, but they had lost their fire. Now they just looked. Confused. Uncertain. Her tray was gone. So was he. The snow had started falling again outside, and her stepmother would be waiting at home, her jaw already tight with rage. She would not be happy that Marisol hadn't failed quietly. Not tonight. "Pack your things, Marisol. You're not welcome here, not after you made me the laughingstock of Santo Cielo." Marisol Ortega blinked awake, her breath catching in the cold morning air. Her blanket was still pulled to her chin, and the soft scent of cinnamon from the night before still clung to her hands. Outside, the church bells were tolling softly Christmas morning. Doña Estela stood at the doorway of the small bedroom, fully dressed in her dark wool coat, lips pressed so tightly they looked like a wound. "What?" Marisol sat up, her heart still half dreaming of children laughing, and a man with kind eyes who said her cookies tasted like home. Estela's fingers were clenched around the handle of her purse, like it was a weapon. "You heard me. Pack what you can carry and be gone before the sun hits the gate." Marisol swung her legs over the bed, bare feet landing on the chill of the clay floor. Her mouth was dry. "I don't understand." "What did I do?" Estela's voice dropped to a hiss. "You embarrassed me in front of everyone, made a spectacle of yourself with those ridiculous cookies, and then allowed that rancher to parade out like some hero while you stood there looking like a wide-eyed fool. I didn't ask him to. You should have stopped him. You should have left before the children even came near. But no, you stayed, smiling like you belonged there." Her nostrils flared. You made a fool of me, Marisol. The room spun for a moment. Marisol reached for the chair beside her bed, steadying herself. It was just cookies, she whispered. Estella laughed, cold and sharp. Nothing is ever just anything in a town like this. You think people didn't notice that they won't talk about how I let you with your face and your size and your delusions stand beside their children, handing out circus animals like some clown. She stepped closer, her voice slicing through the stillness. I've tolerated your presence for 6 years out of pity for your father. But I am finished. You are not my blood. You are not my burden. Marisol stood slowly, wrapping her shawl tight around her. Her throat ached with everything she wouldn't say, how Estella had sold her father's bakery within weeks of his death, how she'd kept the money and called it rent for a roof that never truly sheltered, how she'd clipped Marisol's spirit bit by bit, year after year. Where am I supposed to go? She asked, the words dry and hoarse. Estella turned on her heel. That's not my concern. Maybe you'll find a barn to sleep in. Or better yet, maybe that rancher of yours has room for another mouth to feed. She paused at the doorway, glancing back over her shoulder. You have 1 hour. Anything left behind will be burned. The door closed, and the click of her boots on the tile echoed like gunshots. Marisol didn't cry. There were no tears left for Estella. She moved methodically. Her old canvas bag, the one her father used to carry bread deliveries in, sat folded under the bed. Into it, she packed the essentials, 2 dresses, a worn sweater, her underthings. Her father's recipe book wrapped carefully in a flour sack. The carved elephant mold he'd made when she was 9. A small tin box that held a black and white photo of the 2 of them standing in front of the bakery, both smiling, both flour-dusted and happy. She stood in the center of the room and looked around one last time. This had never been home. Outside, the streets of Santo Cielo were hushed, blanketed in soft snow. Chimneys smoked gently, and the sound of laughter and Christmas music drifted faintly from the neighboring homes. Inside those walls, families exchanged tamales and pan dulce, kissed cheeks, and opened gifts wrapped in cloth. Marisol walked past them all, invisible. She didn't know where her feet were taking her until the town faded behind her, and the trail opened to the red dirt road that led westward toward the hills. The cold gnawed at her fingers, but she walked on over one shoulder, heart heavy in her chest. There was no plan, only movement. The sound of hooves came from behind. She turned. Rafael Morales was astride a dark brown Mustang dusted in snow scarf pulled over his mouth. His eyes found hers, instantly narrowing with concern. He reined in beside her. You walking to Chimayo? He asked, voice muffled beneath the scarf. She shook her head. I don't know, He took a moment, assessing her. The bag, the shawl, the redness around her eyes. What happened? My stepmother, she said, voice steady. She threw me out. Rafa was quiet. His breath came out in a visible puff. Today, this morning, his brow furrowed. It's Christmas. Marisol offered a tight smile. Apparently that doesn't exempt me from being a disgrace. He was already dismounting. You need somewhere warm. I'll figure it out. You shouldn't have to. She looked away, ashamed by how the kindness in his voice almost broke her. I'm not offering pity, he added. I'm offering a deal. I have 6 ranch hands who burn everything they touch. You cook, you eat. I've got an empty guest house on the edge of the property. You'd be alone safe. She hesitated. I wouldn't do anything improper, he said quietly, sensing her fear. I know. So. The air stilled between them. Behind her, the trail led to nothing. Ahead of her, a man stood with mud on his boots and fire in his eyes, and his words felt less like rescue and more like dignity. "I'll work," she said finally. "Every day." He nodded. Then it settled. He secured her bag, then reached for her hand. She paused only for a breath, then let him help her up behind him. They rode toward the mesa in silence, the sound of hooves in snow, the quiet hush of a town she no longer belonged to. As they crested the hill, she saw the Morales ranch spread below them wide and still, with smoke curling from the chimney and orange light glowing behind thick adobe walls. Rafa pointed to the small building near the corral. "That'll be yours. There's a stove, a bed, a table. Kitchen's in the main house. We eat 3 times a day. Sunday off." She nodded, unable to find words. As he slid down and helped her dismount, he added almost as an afterthought, "You don't owe me thanks." "I wasn't going to say it," she said, managing a flicker of a smile. He chuckled softly, brushing snow from her shoulders. She stepped inside the cabin, her breath catching at the warmth. It was small, simple, but it was hers. And for the first time in her life, Marisol Ortega closed a door behind her, not out of fear, but out of hope. Some hearts grow calloused by cruelty. Others, like yours, still rise like fresh pan dulce. Marisol turned the words over in her mind long after the woman who spoke them had left the cabin. She hadn't expected company on her first morning at the Morales ranch. The sunrise barely kissed the mesa tops when a knock came at her cabin door, soft but sure, like someone who never hesitated. When she opened it, a woman with silver-streaked braids and skin the color of riverstone stood on the threshold, bundled in a turquoise shawl and holding a small basket. "Lucia Naranjo," the woman said simply, eyes steady and unreadable. "I live just beyond the west fence. I brought you té de manzanilla. Helps nerves and new starts." Marisol blinked. "How did you—" "Rafael may not talk much," Lucia replied, stepping inside without invitation. "But he doesn't keep secrets. He told me you were here." She moved with the quiet assurance of someone who belonged to the land more than the house she lived in. Her presence filled the tiny space without crowding it. She set the basket down on the wooden table, pulled out a steaming clay mug wrapped in cloth, and pushed it gently toward Marisol. Marisol took it, the warmth bleeding into her palms. "Thank you." Lucia's gaze softened as she studied her. "You look like your papa. Joaquin Ortega, the baker. You knew him, I did. He gave my granddaughter a job once, after her father passed." Her mouth twitched like she was fighting off something tender. "Told her a good bakery is just a kitchen with enough love in it." Marisol's chest tightened. Lucia didn't press. She reached into her skirt pocket, pulled out a folded piece of cloth, and began unwrapping herbs, dried lavender sage and yerba buena, laying them neatly on the table like they were gold coins. "You'll need these if you're cooking for men," she said dryly. "They're stubborn, sweaty, and always hungry. Season their food well, and they'll think you're a saint." Marisol almost laughed. "Almost." Lucia tilted her head. "You're not afraid of work." "I've never been allowed not to work," Marisol said before she could stop herself. Lucia nodded as if that made all the sense in the world. "You'll do fine here. Just remember, this land don't listen to people who shout. It listens to people who show up and stay." Marisol didn't answer. But she felt something stir, a sense that someone had looked at her and seen more than a burden or a body to judge. Lucia reached for her shawl again, pausing at the door. "You come by the house if you need anything," she said. "I make good soup, and I don't like eating alone." Then she was gone, boots crunching against the frost-bitten ground, leaving behind the scent of herbs and something warmer. Trust. Marisol stared at the door long after it closed. She had expected the first day to feel awkward, but the rhythm of the ranch surprised her. The ranch hands, 6 men all dusty from sunrise chores, greeted her with polite nods as Rafa introduced her in the kitchen. No one leered, no one laughed. They just looked tired, hungry. "Breakfast at 7, lunch at noon, dinner at sundown," Rafa said. "Make it hearty. That's the only rule." Marisol opened the pantry and felt a quiet thrill. Sacks of masa beans, dried chiles, a crate of eggs, even fresh apples in a woven basket. Someone had stocked the place well. Maybe Rafa. Maybe his brother. She got to work. By the time the first plate of eggs, potatoes, and tortillas hit the table, the men were watching her like wolves who'd been fed scraps too long. When they took their first bites, a hush fell over the room. Then came the clatter of forks. One of them, broad-shouldered, sun-browned, grinned. "Señorita, you just made me believe in angels." She flushed, but didn't speak, just kept the coffee hot and the tortillas coming. That night after dinner, she slipped out of the kitchen into the fading light. The cabin welcomed her back with silence and the faint scent of flour clinging to her sleeves. She peeled off her shawl, sat on the edge of the bed, and exhaled. It wasn't home. But it wasn't Estella's house either. She was rinsing a tin cup at the water basin when a knock came at the door. Again, this time slower, hesitant. She opened it to find a man leaning on a wooden cane, hair messy, a crooked smile on his lips. "Forgive the late visit," he said. "I'm Diego Morales. I live in the main house. I assume Rafa's told you all about me." "Only that you're his brother," she said. "That's all I am," Diego said with a grin. "But I heard the men say you cooked real food today, and I needed to see the miracle worker myself." Marisol stepped aside. "I don't have anything left, I'm afraid. I didn't come for food." He gestured with a folded piece of paper. "I came to share a poem." She blinked. Poem, I write them. Mostly badly. Sometimes less badly." He sat near the window and read it aloud, about firelight and cinnamon, about the comfort of warm bread and the courage of staying. The words were clumsy in places, but something about his voice made them beautiful. When he finished, he looked up, expecting to be laughed at. Marisol nodded. It was honest. Diego looked startled, then smiled. "That's the nicest thing anyone said about my writing." She offered him the herbs Lucia left behind, and they drank chamomile tea in easy silence. He didn't ask about her past, and she didn't offer. They simply sat, two people who knew something about being unwanted and surviving anyway. When he left, the cabin felt fuller somehow. Later that night, she cracked open her father's recipe book. The pages were worn and smudged with time. She traced the line that read, "Joy is folded into the dough, not sprinkled on top." She set it aside. Tomorrow she would bake. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Outside, the moon hung low over the hills, and inside her heart rose a little, like fresh pan dulce. He can fence a corral ride, a wild horse, and wrestle a steer, but he can't make a tortilla to save his life. The ranch kitchen was filled with the scent of charred beans, and something vaguely metallic, burned egg maybe. Marisol stood in the doorway, lips pressed together, trying not to laugh. Rafael Morales stood at the stove, sleeves rolled, brow furrowed in stubborn determination, as he scraped what looked like a half-melted lump of masa from the griddle. A skillet hissed behind him, spitting oil like an angry cat. She cleared her throat. He turned, startled. Then he sighed, stepping back as if the stove had betrayed him. "I thought I'd get ahead of breakfast, give you a morning off." She stepped inside and set her basket of herbs and flour on the counter. "And this is your version of kindness," He lifted what might have once been a tortilla, holding it between thumb and forefinger. It drooped like a rag. "That obvious, huh?" "You used cold water," she said, opening the pantry without looking at him. "And you didn't let the pan heat right." "I used heat," he muttered. "You used vengeance." She turned, eyes glinting. "Let me take over before you burn down the only kitchen I've had in 6 years." He stepped aside without argument, brushing past her. The contact was brief, just the edge of his shoulder grazing hers, but it sent something warm rippling through her chest. She ignored it, moving into the rhythm that was becoming her own. Within minutes, the hiss of oil was replaced by the scent of onions, peppers, cumin. She rolled tortillas with practiced hands, kneaded dough without thinking, and cracked eggs with one hand. Rafa watched from the side, arms crossed, leaning against the counter. "You make it look easy." Marisol glanced over her shoulder. "It's not. But it's familiar." He watched her in silence for a while, the air between them thick with things not said. Finally he spoke. "My grandmother taught me to ride before I could walk, but she couldn't cook more than beans and rice. My mother passed young." "So did yours. My mother died when I was 6, she said, not looking up. "Papa raised me. He taught me everything in that recipe book. We used to bake all day, sell at dawn, sleep in shifts." He nodded slowly. "He sounds like a good man." He was, until the fever took him. Her hands slowed. After that, Doña Estela took everything. Sold the bakery, sold his horse, said she was owed for raising me. Rafa's jaw tightened. "But I stayed," Marisol added, flipping the tortilla, "because I had nowhere else to go." "You do now." She turned to him, then truly looked at him. The words were simple, but they landed with weight. There was no pity in his voice, just truth. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You earned your place here." He paused, watching the pan. "Just don't let the others find out you're the reason they're not eating ash this morning. They'll expect it every day." Marisol smiled despite herself. By the time the ranch hands arrived, the long wooden table in the dining room was already set with stacks of tortillas, steaming bowls of chilaquiles, and a pot of fresh coffee that filled the air with promise. The men stumbled in with their usual morning silence, but the moment they tasted breakfast, their eyes lit up. "Señorita, you've got magic in those hands," one said with a mouthful of eggs. "Better marry you off quick," Morales another joked, "before someone from town catches wind." Marisol laughed and Rafa rolled his eyes, but there was a flicker of something in his glance, a warmth that made her chest tighten. After breakfast, she lingered in the kitchen, scrubbing pans and humming a soft tune from her childhood. Diego appeared in the doorway, leaning on his cane. "You saved our stomachs, you know," he said with a grin, "and possibly the ranch morale." "Is that so?" He stepped inside and handed her a folded note. "Another poem," he said, "about fresh tortillas and second chances." She wiped her hands on her apron and opened the page. His handwriting was jagged, like it limped across the paper, but the words were tender. He wrote about cinnamon in the air, the soft rhythm of kneading dough, and a kitchen that smelled like forgiveness. When she looked up, he shrugged. "It's not much. It's beautiful." He looked genuinely startled, then pleased. "You're the first to ever say that. You're the first to ever write what I've lived." They stood there for a long beat, quiet and easy, until a knock on the open door interrupted them. Rafa leaned against the frame, arms folded. "I need your help." Marisol straightened. "What's wrong?" He scratched the back of his neck. "I have to ride into town tomorrow. Supplies payroll. Thought maybe you'd come. Learn the route." I can teach you to ride. Marisol blinked. I've never been on a horse. You will be tomorrow. A flicker of panic lit in her chest. I don't know. What if I fall, then I'll catch you? The words were spoken casually, but they rooted in something deep inside her. She hesitated, searching his face. There was no pressure, no teasing, just the same steady presence he always carried. It calmed her more than the tea Lucia brewed. All right, she said, but only if you promise not to laugh. He smiled. I never laugh at courage. As he left, Diego gave her a look that said more than it should. She turned back to the sink cheeks, warm. That evening, Marisol sat in the cabin alone, the recipe book open on her lap. She didn't bake. Instead, she read the notes her father scribbled in the margins. Little things. Always fold the love in early. That way it rises with the heat. She traced the words with her finger. Outside, the wind picked up over the hills. The scent of juniper and cold earth drifted through the cracks in the windows. She wrapped her shawl tighter, set the book aside, and let the silence hold her. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew she would rise for it. Lean into the horse, Marisol. I promise I've got you. The saddle creaked beneath her leather, groaning as she shifted her weight for the third time in as many minutes. Marisol Ortega clutched the horn like it might be the only thing keeping her on earth. Her legs already aching, strained against the stirrups. Her palms were sweating through the thin leather gloves Rafa had handed her, though the morning air still held a bite of frost. The horse beneath her, a patient chestnut mare named Reina, snorted and shuffled, clearly unimpressed with her new rider. I think she knows I'm terrified, Marisol muttered. She does, Rafa said from beside her, adjusting Reina's bridle with calm hands. But she's used to it. She taught my niece to ride. You have a niece, had he said, then looked up quickly. She lives in Santa Fe now. Too grown up for ranch visits. Marisol nodded, not pushing. There was a quietness to the way Rafa carried things, grief, memory, responsibility, like a man who had long since made peace with the weight he bore, but never stopped feeling it. He mounted his own horse in one smooth motion, and Marisol blinked. He looked so natural up there, like part of the animal, like someone carved from the land itself. His silhouette against the early light made her chest tighten for reasons she didn't want to name. You ready? He asked. No. He smiled. Good. Fear means you're paying attention. She breathed in through her nose, tightening her grip. The sun had just cleared the rim of the eastern hills, painting the horizon in pale oranges and soft golds. The ranch below them was beginning to stir thin trails of smoke, curling from chimneys, cattle moving in distant pens, the bark of a dog echoing faintly across the land. Rafa gave Reina a soft click, and the horse stepped forward. Marisol held her breath as her own mare followed, walking slowly along the inner corral fence. Keep your heels down, he said, voice low and steady. Let your body move with her, not against. I am moving, she whispered through gritted teeth. Just not the way I want to. Relax your back. Don't fight her rhythm. Easy for him to say. She felt like every muscle in her body was clenching, trying to keep from sliding off. But she tried. After a few steps, something shifted. Her hips began to follow Reina's motion. Her legs loosened. She wasn't so much sitting on the horse as balancing with it. I think I'm doing it, she said, surprised. You are. They circled the corral twice before he gently brought them to a stop. Marisol's heart was still racing, but for the first time she realized it wasn't just from nerves. It was from something like pride. How'd I do? Rafa shrugged. You didn't fall. She squinted at him. high praise. I don't pass out compliments, señorita. You want gold stars, talk to Diego. She laughed despite herself. The breeze tugged at her braid, and the sound of her own voice surprised her. Light. Free. They rode side by side through the pasture, the horses moving at a walk. The land rolled gently, dotted with chamisa shrubs and the skeletal remains of last summer's sunflowers. Snow still clung to the shaded slopes, but patches of exposed earth hinted at the season beginning to turn. Marisol glanced sideways. Do you ride every morning? Not lately, he said. Used to. Before. Things changed. She waited. My wife left 2 years ago. The words hung in the cold air like smoke. She said ranch life was too quiet, he continued, too far from music and crowds. Said I was too much in my head and not enough in hers. Marisol didn't speak, just listened. She packed a bag one morning, left a note on the stove, took the stage to Albuquerque that same day. I'm sorry, she said softly. He shrugged, but it wasn't casual. We wanted different things. She wanted the city. I wanted the land. Some people aren't meant to be still. They rode in silence for a time. Birds flitted between fence posts. Somewhere in the distance, a windmill creaked. I didn't fall in love with her because she made sense, he added. I loved her because she was a flame. But flames burn out. Marisol looked down at her hands curled gently around the reins. I've never had anyone love me like that. Even my father. He loved me in pieces, through pastries, through flour on my nose. But he never said the words. Words matter less than consistency, Rafa said. He stayed, didn't he? He stayed. They came to a small rise overlooking the town in the distance. Santo Cielo looked like a collection of scattered toys, rooftops dusted in white, the steeple glinting under sunlight, smoke drifting up in ribbons. Rafa dismounted and held a hand up to her. I don't think I can get down gracefully, she said. You think I care? She took his hand. He guided her down slowly, his palm firm against her lower back as she slid from the saddle. Her boots touched the frozen grass, and she staggered slightly right into him. His hands caught her elbows. They were close. Too close. She didn't move. His eyes met hers, steady and unreadable. She realized in that quiet space between breath and heartbeat that she trusted him more than she'd trusted anyone since her father. His hands slid away. Let's sit, he said, nodding toward a flat rock near the trail. They sat side by side, the horses grazing nearby, and watched the town shimmer in the winter sun. You didn't have to help me, Marisol said finally. You didn't even know me. I knew enough, he said. I saw the way you handed that cookie to the girl at the posada, like it was a treasure. I saw the look on your face when the others laughed. And I saw what was in your hands, something made with care. She swallowed hard. Most people just see my shape, or my silence. I see someone who carries a lot more than anyone knows. They sat for a long while after that. No words, no noise. Just the wind moving through dry grass and the rustle of saddle leather. Eventually, he stood offering her a hand again. She took it. They rode back slowly, Reina walking steady beneath her. Marisol no longer gripped the saddle horn like a lifeline. She let herself sway with the rhythm of the horse, the motion almost soothing now. By the time they reached the ranch gates, her body ached in places she didn't know existed, but her heart felt strangely light. Not fixed, not healed, but open. And that was more than she thought possible. I want to kiss you, Marisol, but not like this. Not while you work for me. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, casting golden light across the floor of the Morales ranch house. Outside, the wind swept across the mesa, moaning low through the pine, and flurries of snow tapped gently against the windows. Inside, it was warm, too warm maybe, but Marisol didn't mind. Not tonight. She sat cross-legged on the rug in front of the fire, nursing a tin mug of cinnamon tea. Her hair was still damp from a quick wash braided loosely over her shoulder. Her shawl hung off the back of the chair, and her boots rested near the hearth to dry. The silence between her and Raphael wasn't awkward. It was the kind of quiet that felt earned, like the end of a long song, where both listener and player understood something had been shared. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed one shoulder, catching the firelight. His hair was tousled from the wind, and there was a smudge of ash on his cheek. Marisol thought he looked tired in the way men looked when they'd spent years holding things together with their hands, land family dignity, and were finally sitting down. The ranch hands had gone into town for the New Year's dance. Diego left just after dinner, cane in hand, promising not to stay too long and not to drink too much, both lies. Rafa hadn't even put on his coat. "You could have gone," Marisol said. He shook his head. "Not much for dancing." "You don't like music, I like quiet better." She smiled. "That I believe." He moved to the fire, crouching to toss another log onto the embers. The flames roared to life, dancing shadows across his face. When he sat back, it was on the rug beside her. "Why didn't you go?" he asked. She shrugged, her voice softer. "I wasn't invited." His gaze lingered on her face. "You'd be the best-looking woman there." She didn't look at him. Her fingers tightened around the mug. Compliments still made her nervous, like they were traps disguised as kindness. "I'm not made for dances," she murmured. "You're made for more than you think." His words weren't flattery. They came with the same slow conviction he carried into every room. They sank deep. Marisol glanced at him then, and for a moment neither of them looked away. The fire popped. Rafa shifted slightly, reaching for the bottle of apple cider left by the hearth. He poured a little into a mug, handed it to her. She took it, their fingers brushing. "Tell me something you've never said out loud," she said suddenly. He blinked, then smiled faintly. "That's not how quiet people operate. Humor me." He looked into the fire. The flicker of flame made his features softer, almost younger. She could see the boy he used to be. "I'm lonely," he said. Marisol's breath caught. "I tell myself I'm not," he added. "I've got land. Work. Diego. But some nights," he paused, "some nights it feels like everything I've built is just walls around an empty room." She nodded slowly. "I know that feeling." "What about you?" he asked, voice low. She hesitated. "Then I've never had a place where I wasn't just tolerated." "You're not tolerated here." "I know," she whispered. They sat in silence again, but this time it pulsed with something heavier, hope or longing, or maybe both. Rafa turned toward her fully, now one knee bent. He was close, closer than he'd ever been. She could see the faint scar along his jawline, the way his lashes caught the light. "I want to kiss you, Marisol," he said, voice barely above a breath. Her heart thundered in her chest. "But not like this," he added, jaw tight. "Not while you work for me. It wouldn't be right." She didn't move. "I didn't hire you to find a reason to stay," he said. "But if you stay, I want it to be your choice. Not out of debt, not out of need." Marisol swallowed the lump in her throat. "You think I don't know the difference?" He searched her eyes. I think most folks don't. I'm not most folks. I know. He stood abruptly, running a hand through his hair, like stepping back was the only way to keep from crossing a line. The air between them cooled like the distance had robbed it of something vital. Good night, Marisol. Her chest ached with words she didn't know how to say, so she just nodded. Good night, Raphael. He paused at the door, looking like he wanted to say something more. But he left it there, walking down the hall and disappearing into the quiet of the house. Marisol sat by the fire long after it burned down to coals. She touched her lips, and even though they hadn't kissed, she could still feel the weight of what almost happened. She wasn't foolish. She knew the way the town would twist it. A cook and her boss whispers over fences and behind church pews. The way people reduced affection to scandal. But none of that mattered tonight, because for the first time in her life she wasn't invisible. She was wanted, seen. And that terrified her more than any kind of cruelty ever had. Eventually, she gathered her shawl, slipped her boots on, and stepped out into the snow. The night was bright with stars, the moon hanging full and pale over the ridge. She stood there, breathing in the cold air, watching her breath rise like smoke. Every inch of her ached from the ride, but the deeper ache was something else, something older. She walked the short path back to her cabin, opened the door, and stepped into the stillness. Inside the room smelled like cinnamon and cedar. She sat on the edge of the bed and let herself feel it, the want, the hope, the fear, because it was real now. And it wasn't just a cookie that tasted like home. It was him. If housing a decent woman is a crime, then you better arrest me too. The knock came just after dawn. Not the polite kind. This one was firm, hollow, meant to summon rather than announce. Raphael looked up from the ledger in his hands, eyes narrowing. Outside, a light snow was falling, and the wind had gone still as if holding its breath. Tomas, one of the ranch hands, stepped into the doorway of the barn. His hat was in his hands, which he never did unless something was wrong. "Sheriff's here," he said quietly, "with the deputy and Senora Vidal." Raphael's stomach dropped. He set down the ledger without a word and stepped into the morning chill. Sheriff Benicio Ruiz sat astride a pale gray horse dusted with frost. Next to him, Deputy Tomas Naranjo had his hand resting casually on the butt of his sidearm, though his face looked more embarrassed than anything else. And beside them, wrapped in a fur-lined cloak and righteous indignation, was Senora Vidal, the mayor's wife. "What can I do for you?" Sheriff Raphael asked as he approached. Benicio dismounted, tugging his gloves tighter. "Need to speak to your cook." Raphael's jaw tensed. "About what?" "There's been a formal complaint." "What kind of complaint?" Senora Vidal's voice cut through the air like a knife. "A moral one." Raphael turned slowly to face her. "Moral? She's been living on your property," she said, voice high and pinched. "Unchaperoned, in clear violation of this town's standards. She lives in a separate cabin. Works in my kitchen. That's it. She's an unmarried woman, Raphael," she snapped. "Living alone, visiting the main house, spending long hours under your roof. People talk." "Let them," he said coldly. The complaint was filed by Doña Estela Ortega. The sheriff said, his voice tight with discomfort. "She's claiming Marisol has brought shame on her household and is living here in impropriety." Raphael's hands curled into fists. Because she gave out cookies at a Christmas party. Because she didn't shrivel when someone showed her kindness. "I'm sorry," Sheriff Ruiz said, shifting his weight. "But the mayor's pushing this hard. His wife's behind it." "You mean the same wife who humiliated Marisol in front of half the town?" Raphael snapped. I need to bring her in, the sheriff said, not meeting his eyes. She hasn't done anything wrong. She's living here, unmarried. That's enough. A door creaked open behind them. Marisol stepped out of the guest cabin, wrapped in her shawl, her braid over her shoulder. Her eyes were wide but calm. "What's going on?" she asked, voice low. Raphael turned toward her, mouth opening, but the sheriff beat him to it. "Miss Ortega," he said gently, "I'm afraid there's been a complaint filed against you for moral misconduct. I need to take you in until the town can hold a hearing." Marisol froze. Deputy Naranjo shifted awkwardly. "We're just following procedure. She didn't do anything," Diego's voice rang out from behind them. He limped down the steps of the main house, his cane thudding with each stride. "She cooks. She works. She keeps to herself." "Maybe so," Vidal said, her lip curling. "But appearance matters." "She's not a criminal," Diego snapped. "She's not going anywhere," Raphael said, stepping between Marisol and the lawmen. "If housing a decent woman is a crime, then you better arrest me too." The air went silent. Sheriff Ruiz sighed. "Don't make this harder than it is. I'm not letting you take her. It'll only be a few days, Rafa. A week at most. A week in a jail cell for what?" "For the town to feel better about themselves," Marisol said softly. Everyone turned toward her. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice didn't tremble. "It's all right," she said. "I'll go." "No," Raphael said, stepping closer. "You won't. I won't let you lose everything because of me." She turned to the sheriff. "I'll come quietly. There's no need for a scene." Raphael looked like he wanted to argue, but she reached up and touched his arm just once, just enough. "I have survived worse," she whispered. He clenched his jaw. Marisol turned and faced Sheriff Ruiz. "I'm ready." He nodded, his face unreadable. Deputy Naranjo led the horse closer. Raphael helped her up without speaking, his hand lingering just a moment too long on her arm. She looked back only once, her eyes meeting his, and something in that look cut deeper than anything words could do. "I'll get you out," he said, his voice rough. "I promise." She nodded. Then the horse turned and the sheriff led her away from the ranch, her silhouette growing smaller against the white horizon. Raphael stood in the frozen mud, the world narrowed to the sound of hooves and the hollow ache in his chest. Diego limped up beside him. "We can't let them do this." "I won't." The other ranch hands had gathered silently behind them. Tomas, Marcos, Elias, all with hard eyes and tight jaws. "What now, boss?" Tomas asked. Raphael didn't answer right away. He looked out over the snow-covered hills toward the town he'd once believed in, the church that now felt like a stranger, and the people who cared more about appearances than truth. He turned back toward the house. "We go to Santo Cielo," he said, "and we end this. They can lock my body, Lucia, but not my spirit and not my father's recipes." The cell was colder than she expected. Not just the air which seeped through the stone walls like fog from the mountain, but the silence. The kind that wrapped around her bones, settling in deeper with each hour. Marisol sat curled on the cot, knees hugged to her chest, wrapped in the same shawl she'd worn when Rafa lifted her onto the sheriff's horse. There was no window, just a narrow slit near the ceiling where morning light filtered in like a pale sigh. The scent of dust and rusted iron filled the space. Her fingers itched for flour, for dough, for a rolling pin, and the quiet rhythm of kneading, for something that proved she still existed beyond accusation. The jailer hadn't said much when she arrived. Sheriff Ruiz himself had led her in, looking more ashamed than stern. "I'm sorry, Miss Ortega," he'd said, not meeting her eyes. "This is temporary." Then he'd handed her off to a young deputy who locked the door with more nerves than authority. Now, hours later, the sound of the outer door creaked open. Footsteps. Then a voice. Sweet saints, you'd think they'd at least put you somewhere with heat. Marisol's head lifted. Lucia Naranjo stepped into the dim hallway like she owned it, basket in hand, her shawl pulled tight against the cold. The deputy followed behind her, looking unsure of himself. "I told him if he didn't let me in, I'd start boiling sage water outside the building and tell everyone the sheriff's office was cursed," Lucia said, setting the basket down by the bars. They folded quicker than day-old buñuelos. Marisol smiled despite herself. "I believe you." Lucia crouched, her knees cracking loudly. She passed a steaming jar through the bars, then unwrapped a cloth bundle filled with warm cornbread and slices of roasted apple. "You didn't have to." "I don't visit the innocent out of obligation," Lucia said firmly. "I do it because someone should." Marisol took the food with shaking hands. Her throat tightened at the first bite. It wasn't just the flavor, it was the heat, the reminder that the world outside still existed. That kindness hadn't frozen. "They say the mayor's wife is calling for a public hearing," Lucia continued. "Said she won't rest until decency is restored." She snorted. "That woman's idea of decency is tighter than her corset." "She wants to shame me," Marisol said softly. "That's all this is." Lucia's eyes narrowed. "You think that matters?" "Truth doesn't need a title. It just needs someone brave enough to stand behind it." "I'm just a cook, Lucia. You're a woman who makes things with her hands when the world tries to take them away. You carry memory and recipes and strength in silence." She paused. "You think that's small?" Marisol stared at the wall, voice low. "They can lock my body, Lucia, but not my spirit and not my father's recipes. That's the woman I came to see." Lucia smiled, lines deepening around her eyes. Marisol ate slowly, each bite grounding her. The ache in her chest loosened just a little. "I never asked," she said quietly. "How did you know my father?" Lucia leaned back against the opposite wall. "Years ago, before he married your mother, he brought bread to my house when my husband died. Said grief was lighter with sugar. I never forgot that. He said that to me once," Marisol whispered, "when I cried over burning the empanadas. Grief is lighter with sugar. I didn't understand it back then." "You do now." Marisol's eyes stung, but she nodded. "He would have liked you." "Course he would have." Lucia stood stretching. "And if he were here, I imagine he'd be outside this jail with a rolling pin ready to crack heads." Marisol laughed through the lump in her throat. Before she left, Lucia pressed her fingers through the bars and gripped Marisol's hand tightly. "You hold fast. Raphael's not sitting quiet, you know." Marisol blinked. "What?" "He's already stirred up half the ranchers and called for an emergency town meeting. They'll have to let you speak." Marisol's stomach flipped. "What am I supposed to say?" "Speak from where you need, not from where you fear. That's how women like us get heard." Lucia was gone a moment later, her boots echoing down the hallway. Marisol sat in the silence that followed, but now it felt different. Less like punishment, more like pause. She took out the small tin she'd hidden in her shawl, tucked deep into its inner pocket, the one she'd refused to let Estella burn. Inside was the photograph, her and her father standing outside the bakery, in matching aprons, both smiling, wind-blown arms dusted with flour. She pressed her thumb to the glass. "I'm still here," she whispered. That night she didn't sleep. Instead, she memorized the feeling of her father's hands guiding hers through dough, the smell of cinnamon and anise, the way joy used to feel when it came easy. By dawn, the sound of boots returned. This time it was the sheriff. "You're needed at the town hall," he said, unlocking the door. Marisol stood, straightened her shawl, and stepped out of the cell. The hallway was full of people, ranchers, townsfolk, men and women who had once looked through her like she was air. Now they stepped aside, making room. At the front of the hall, waiting beneath the light of a stained glass window, was Raphael. Hat in his hands, jaw set, eyes locked on hers. She walked down the aisle between them, her spine straight, her steps steady. No shame, no fear, and nothing left to hide. "You mocked her cookies, you mocked her face, but you never saw her heart." "I did, and I love her." The town hall of Santo Cielo had never held this many people. The wooden pews groaned under the weight of judgment and curiosity, every seat taken, the rest of the crowd lining the walls or pressing toward the back. The air smelled of dust-pressed wool and tension. Marisol sat near the front, flanked by Deputy Naranjo and Sheriff Ruiz. Her shawl rested over her shoulders like armor, but her fingers were cold. Eyes followed her like shadows. She felt their stares, some curious, some cruel, others merely waiting to see a fire lit. Across the aisle, Doña Estela sat 3 rows back, lips pursed, gloved hands folded neatly over a black handbag. Her eyes never met Marisol's. They didn't have to. The contempt rolled off her like perfume. Mayor Jorge Vidal banged the gavel twice. "This emergency hearing has been convened to address the complaint filed against Miss Marisol Ortega by her stepmother, Doña Estela Ortega, supported by Señora Vidal, my wife." A murmur swept the crowd. The mayor didn't look pleased to be standing there, but duty or his wife compelled him. "Allegations of impropriety have been raised regarding Miss Ortega's living arrangements at the Morales Ranch," he continued, adjusting his spectacles. "At this time, any citizen may request the floor." Raphael stood. "I request it." The room hushed. Mayor Vidal sighed. "Mr. Morales, there is a process." "I'm not asking for permission," Raphael said, stepping forward. "I'm exercising my right as a citizen. Or do those rights not apply when someone questions your wife's judgment?" That got the crowd's attention. The mayor hesitated, then nodded. "You have the floor." Raphael turned toward the crowd, eyes sweeping the room slowly. He wasn't a polished speaker. He didn't speak like the mayor or the reverend or the shopkeepers who liked to hear themselves echo. But his voice was solid, grounded like the earth itself. "I don't care what rumors you've heard. I'll tell you the truth of what happened." He looked to Marisol, and something softened in his eyes before he returned his gaze to the room. 3 weeks ago, at the Christmas posada, Miss Ortega brought cookies, bizcochitos shaped like elephants. Cookies her father taught her to make. A good man, most of you knew him. She brought them to share joy. A few heads dipped as if remembering. But instead of kindness, she got cruelty. You laughed at her. Not because the cookies were bad, but because you could. Because someone told you it was okay to tear down a quiet girl who's never caused harm to anyone. Whispers stirred. Eyes turned downward. "I took those cookies," he said, "because they reminded me of my grandmother's kitchen. Because they tasted like the childhood I forgot I had. And because they were made with more heart than anything I've ever eaten." He paused, voice tightening. The next day, Doña Estela threw her out. On Christmas. Because Marisol's presence embarrassed her. Not because of anything Marisol did, but because her very existence made Estela look in the mirror and see her own hollowness. Gasps flickered in the room like match heads. Estella sat stiff as stone, her lips pressed even thinner. I offered Marisol a job, a home, not charity. Work. She's fed 6 men at my ranch 3 times a day since then. She lives in a separate cabin. She's never asked for anything she didn't earn. He gestured to the ranch hands standing quietly along the wall. Tomas Marcos, Elias Diego. Men who knew the truth. Ask them, Rafael said. Ask them what kind of woman Marisol is. She's decent, Tomas said. Loud, clear. She works hard. She don't take up more space than she needs. She minds her own, Marcos added. She's never been anything but respectful. She's the best cook I've ever known, Elias said with a grin. And she makes a house feel like a home. Diego stepped forward, cane tapping on the floor. His voice didn't shake. She made this broken place feel warm again. That's more than I can say for half the people here. Rafael faced the crowd again. So let's stop pretending this is about morality. It's not. It's about a stepmother who wanted her gone. It's about people who think kindness is weakness, who look at a woman's body and see something to scorn instead of someone to respect. He turned to Marisol. His voice dropped, but it carried. You mocked her cookies. You mocked her face, but you never saw her heart. I did. And I love her. A collective gasp moved through the room like wind before a storm. Rafael stepped toward her slowly, every eye in the room following. Grace, he said, then corrected himself softly, Marisol. I'm sorry I'm doing this in front of all these people, but I need them to hear it. You've made my house feel like home again. You've made me laugh when I didn't remember how. You've reminded me that love isn't loud, it's steady. He dropped to one knee. Marisol Ortega, will you marry me? Marisol's hand flew to her mouth. Silence. Then a few gasps. Then stillness again, waiting. She didn't cry. Not right away. She stood slowly, stepping forward, eyes never leaving his. Yes, she whispered. Then louder for the room that had tried to crush her. Rafael rose and pulled her into his arms, the room blurring behind them. Half the crowd burst into spontaneous applause. The other half, they just watched, stone-faced, unchanged. But it didn't matter anymore. From the back, a new voice cut through. Padre Ignacio stood clearing his throat. If they consent, I'll marry them right here, right now. That would nullify the moral charges, wouldn't it? Mayor Vidal looked to his wife, whose face was pale with fury. He nodded stiffly. It would. Then let's have a wedding, the priest said, walking to the front. Doña Estela shot to her feet. This is an outrage. Sit down, Estela, the mayor snapped for the first time in public. You've done enough. The Reverend placed a hand on Rafael's shoulder, then turned to Marisol. Do you wish to be wed? She nodded, voice steady. I do. And you, Rafael, I always have. The words were spoken simply, but they were holy. The ceremony took no more than 5 minutes. When Rafael kissed her, Marisol felt everything that had ever broken inside her begin to knit back together. The applause was just noise. All she saw was him. They were married, right there in front of the town that once called her a joke. And all at once she wasn't alone anymore. I didn't marry you to be rescued, Rafael. I married you because I saw the storm in you and wasn't afraid. The kitchen was thick with the smell of cinnamon and sugar, the air warm from the oven, and sunlight spilling through the lace curtains. Marisol's hands worked quickly, fingers dusted in flower sleeves rolled to the elbows, hair tied back with one of the blue ribbons Rafa had picked up from the general store, awkwardly wrapped in butcher paper like he'd bought dynamite. It had been 3 weeks since the wedding. 3 quiet weeks filled with routines that stitched themselves around her like a second skin. Morning rides, biscuits at sunrise, long silences by the fire that said more than words ever could. But quiet didn't mean peace. She felt it even now, tight around the edges of her chest. A tension, like something was waiting. Rafa hadn't said much since the wedding day. He kissed her with reverence, held her hand like a promise, but there was distance. Not in space, but in spirit. As if he was waiting for something to fall apart, like he didn't quite trust the good. Marisol pressed her thumb into the dough, leaving perfect crescents for the sugar to cling to. She knew what this was. She'd grown up inside people's doubts, learned to smell the smoke before the fire. The front door creaked. She dusted her hands on her apron and stepped into the front room. Rafa stood in the entryway, shoulders damp from snow boots tracking melted water onto the rug. He held a telegram in one hand, the paper already crumpled, the ink smeared where his thumb had pressed too hard. "You're late," she said gently. "I stopped at the post office." She walked closer, wiping her hands on a towel. "Bad news," he handed it to her without speaking. The telegram was short, written in the clipped tones of out-of-town formality. To Rafael Morales, stop. Claim dispute. Filed on Northwest Range. Stop counsel hearing to be held next Monday. Stop advised to prepare legal defense. Stop. Marisol looked up. "The range, your grazing land." He nodded, jaw tight. "Someone's trying to push me out. Says I'm squatting on federal acres. But your family's owned that land for generations. There's no title. Just a handshake and a boundary marker carved into stone." She stared at him, heart heavy. "Do you know who—" He took off his hat, ran a hand through his hair. "Vidal's cousin. He's been sniffing around the council for years, looking to snatch up land with water access. And the marriage didn't cool the fire. It threw kerosene on it." Marisol set the telegram down and reached for his hand. He didn't pull away, but he didn't grip back either. His fingers just sat there, still uncertain. "I can't lose this ranch," he said quietly. "It's not just dirt. It's my father's bones. It's where my mother planted sage and buried saints in the fence posts. It's everything. You won't lose it." His eyes flicked to hers. "You don't know that." "No," she said, stepping closer. "But I know this: if they come for what's yours, they're coming for what's mine too." He finally looked at her, the wall behind his eyes beginning to crack. "I didn't marry you to be rescued, Raphael. I married you because I saw the storm in you and wasn't afraid." He exhaled sharply, like she'd taken something off his chest he'd been too proud to name. She pulled him into the kitchen, made him sit, poured coffee, and slid a warm cookie onto a plate. He stared at it. "What is it, empanada?" "With piñón and honey." He took a bite. Silence. Then another. Then a soft sound, barely more than breath. She looked at him, and there it was, relief. Not the kind you shout about. The kind that settles behind the ribs and lets you breathe for the first time all day. He looked up. "You're going to feed me through a war, aren't you?" "That's the plan." They ate in silence for a moment. Outside, snow began to fall heavier, laying soft blankets over the world. The ranch was still. Only the wind moved. "We have a week," Rafa said finally, "to prepare a defense. I'll ride to Albuquerque. Try to find records, anything. I'll go with you." He hesitated. "Don't start with the protectiveness," she warned. "I spent my whole life being left behind. I'm not doing that anymore." He gave her a slow smile, small but true. all right. That night she lay awake beside him in the dark. The wind howled against the window, and his hand rested over hers beneath the blanket. There were no vows spoken, no reassurances, just skin on skin, warmth in the cold. In the morning, she would rise early, pack what they needed, wrap the tin of cookies because people listened more when sweetness softened the sharp. And when they left, it would not be as a man dragging his burden behind him, but as two people walking into a storm together. Because now everything that threatened him threatened her too. And she had no intention of watching anything she loved get taken again. Let them try to erase our name. I'll write it again in flower and fire, and in every story they whisper about this land. The hearing was set in the council building on the edge of town, a square block of adobe and sandstone that looked more like a chapel than a courtroom. Inside, the benches were filled with landowners, townsfolk, and a few opportunists with too much interest in the outcome. Men who smelled of paper ink and greed. Marisol sat at Raphael's side, her hands folded in her lap. She wore her best dress, a deep burgundy that once belonged to Lucia, and a silver brooch at her collar, shaped like a sprig of sage. She had braided her hair tight, as if armor grew from the scalp, and she held her silence with the weight of a woman who had spent too long learning when not to speak. Raphael sat tall beside her, eyes fixed on the council table ahead. 4 men. One with a ledger thick as scripture, another with the pinched mouth of someone used to getting his way. Mayor Vidal was absent, recused due to family conflict. His replacement, a weathered rancher named Mr. Cordero, sat in the center hat, resting on the desk, before him fingers templed. Doña Estela was there, of course, seated smug in the back, eyes sharp beneath her veil. And next to her, her nephew Luis Ortega, the cousin from Santa Fe who'd filed the claim. A man with polished boots, a lawyer's tongue, and the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. Mr. Ortega, one councilman said, you may state your case. Luis stood, cleared his throat, and began. He spun a story, slick with precision, how the Morales family had never registered their northern acres with the Territorial Land Office, how the grazing rights lapsed after Raphael's grandfather died, how the land had since reverted to the state and was now open to claim. Marisol could feel Raphael's pulse from where their hands touched. Luis continued, laying maps on the table. Surveyors' marks, boundary lines. It all looked official, sterile, inevitable. Therefore, Luis concluded, we submit that the Morales claim is invalid and that the range in question be returned to state jurisdiction to be reassigned to a responsible steward, namely the Ortega family. He sat. Silence followed. Then Mr. Cordero nodded. Mr. Morales, you may respond. Raphael stood. His shoulders squared, his voice steady. My family settled that land in 1839, he said. There were no papers back then, just hands' work and respect. We built fences, not walls. We drew borders with river stones and cedar. And we never asked for more than we needed. He paused, glanced at Marisol, then back to the men. You want proof? Look at the soil. It still holds my grandfather's sweat. Look at the house, it's made of trees we felled with our own backs. My mother's sage bush still grows wild by the fence line. Sentiment isn't ownership. Luis interrupted, smiling faintly. Raphael didn't flinch. No. But stewardship is. Cordero held up a hand. Let him finish. We've maintained that land for 80 years. We've never let it fall to ruin, never overgrazed, never abandoned it during drought or fire. Can the Ortegas say the same? Luis's jaw clenched. Raphael stepped closer to the council table. This isn't just about land. It's about legacy. about whether history matters more than paperwork, and whether a name built on soil and blood can be erased by someone with a fountain pen. He turned toward the crowd. You all know me. You've seen my hands, my back, my work. I've never once asked this town for anything I didn't earn. But today I'm asking you to see that worth doesn't only live in ink. It lives in the people who show up year after year and don't quit. The room fell into a thick, uneasy silence. Then, unexpectedly, Marisol stood. The councilman blinked at her. I'd like to speak. Luis looked irritated, but Cordero gestured for her to come forward. She stepped up to the front, slowly heart pounding, but gaze steady. My name is Marisol Ortega Morales, she said, and I've lived on that land for just a short time, but I've seen what it means. It's not just pasture. It's story. It's ritual. I've baked bread in a kitchen built by hands that knew hunger. I've planted herbs in soil that remembers better days. Luis scoffed. We're not here to hear about your kitchen. She ignored him. I come from a long line of bakers, people who had nothing but flour and heat. But we knew what to do with both. And in that land I found the same thing, resilience, tradition, the kind of memory that keeps you rooted even when others try to dig you out. She turned to the council. Let them try to erase our name, I'll write it again in flour and fire, and in every story they whisper about this land. Cordero leaned back, rubbing his jaw. You done I am. Luis stood abruptly. This is irrelevant. It's truth, Cordero cut in. And sometimes that's what people need reminding of. The other councilmen exchanged murmurs. Cordero sighed. We'll deliberate. Expect a decision by sundown. Rafael helped Marisol back to her seat. He didn't speak, but his hand found hers, and when their fingers laced together, they didn't let go. They left the hall in silence, walking into the cold afternoon air. The sky was low with cloud, the air heavy. But as they reached the horses, Rafael paused. You didn't have to stand up there. I did. He looked at her, something close to awe in his eyes. I don't want to lose this land, he said quietly. Then we won't. He pulled her into him, resting his forehead to hers. Even if we do, she whispered, they'll never take what we built here. And with that, they waited for the sun to decide their fate. Home isn't something you're given. It's something you defend, even if it means standing alone. The fire had burned low in the hearth, casting a dim orange glow across the wooden floor. Raphael sat on the edge of the armchair, boots unlaced, elbows on his knees, staring into the fading light, like it might whisper the verdict before the messenger arrived. Marisol moved quietly behind him, her shawl draped around her shoulders, the scent of cinnamon still clinging to her apron from the last batch of cookies she'd pulled out hours ago and left untouched on the table. They hadn't spoken since returning from town. There were no words left. Only waiting. Outside wind swept across the land, like a broom clearing dust from an old table. The horses in the barn shifted occasionally, the only sign that life continued beyond the cabin walls. Then came the knock. Not sharp or hasty, measured, as if the bearer already knew the weight of what he carried. Raphael stood, his movements heavy, and opened the door. Cordero stood under the porch light, hat in hand. Snow clung to the shoulders of his coat, melting in slow trails down his sleeves. He looked tired, older than he had just hours ago. Evening, he said. Evening, Raphael returned. Marisol stepped forward, standing beside her husband. Well, she asked, her voice quiet but clear. Cordero took a long breath and nodded once. The council voted. It was close, but the land stays with the Morales name. Raphael's shoulders sagged, not in weakness, but in the kind of relief that left a man rooted to the spot. Marisol closed her eyes. I made it clear, Cordero went on, that this wasn't just about dirt. It was about integrity, and about folks remembering where their bread's buttered and who's done the work in this town since before it had a name. He offered a slip of paper. You'll want to file this with the recorder's office. It's not a deed, but it's recognition of stewardship. It'll hold in court if they try again. Raphael took it, folding it carefully like it was scripture. Thank you. Cordero tipped his head toward Marisol. It was her words that swayed them in the end. You picked yourself a woman worth listening to. I know, Raphael said. As the door closed behind the councilman, silence returned, but it was a different silence now. Not tense, just full. Marisol stepped over to the table and lifted a cookie, pressing it into Raphael's hand. Eat, she said gently. You haven't touched a thing all day. He looked at it, then at her, and finally took a bite. She watched him as he chewed, then swallowed, and for the first time in days, he smiled. I don't know how you do it, he said softly. Do what makes sugar taste like strength. She chuckled and sank into the chair across from him. My father used to say the same thing. He leaned back, eyes on the ceiling. I didn't think we'd win. I did, she said, because we didn't just have history on our side. We had each other. The fire cracked softly behind them. He reached across the table, fingers brushing hers. I still don't feel safe, he admitted, even with that paper. I feel like I'm waiting for the next fight. You're not alone anymore, she said, and that makes all the difference. They spent the evening in easy quiet, the kind that settles when a storm has passed. The next morning, the sun rose gold over the hills, lighting up the snow-covered pasture like glass. Word spread fast. By midday, the ranch hands returned with fresh supplies and laughter. Tomas brought extra oats, Elias repaired the fence near the west line, and Marcos carved a new nameplate for the front gate, Rancho Morales Ortega. Lucia arrived with jars of pickled vegetables and a grin wide enough to split her face. You know, she said to Marisol, this town might still be full of snakes, but at least they learned not to bite without tasting their own venom. Marisol hugged her tight. I'm not afraid of snakes anymore. That evening, as the sky bled into deep lavender and stars began to prickle through, Raphael led Marisol out to the northern edge of the ranch. There, beneath the oldest juniper tree, he held out a small pouch. Inside was a single round river stone, weathered smooth. My grandfather marked the boundary with these, he said. We only ever found a few left. But this one's ours. He knelt and set it gently into the dirt, brushing away snow, packing earth around it with his palm. When he looked up at her, there was something unshakable in his eyes. I want our children to know where it all began. Marisol crouched beside him and laid her hand over his. Then let's plant memory here, she whispered. Not just stone, but roots. They stayed like that, as the wind picked up their hands in the soil, the sky stretching wide above them. The land beneath them no longer felt fragile. It felt claimed not just by law, but by love, by labor, by the quiet fury of survival. Later they walked back to the house hand in hand. Inside, the fire burned again. The kitchen smelled of something sweet. The table was set for two. Raphael stopped at the door, looking out one last time at the vast, dark land behind them. It's funny, he murmured. I always thought home was the house, the land. But now, she leaned into him. Now you know. He nodded. Home isn't something you're given. It's something you defend, even if it means standing alone. She smiled. Good thing neither of us has to anymore. And with that, they stepped inside together. The door closed behind them. The wind passed over the roof and moved on. And in that quiet house in the heart of that once hardened land, something soft finally bloomed.